Okay, so this is my second attempt to record this so that you guys can have access to it. The intent of this video is to explain to you what confidentiality means, but then to also explain to you what you are going to say to your students who you're going to work with one-on-one. So the first thing you need to know is that confidentiality is actually an ethical term that is used by school counselors and other professionals. Confidentiality means that you as the school counselor cannot tell anyone else what you and the student talk about in an individual meeting. It means you can't tell the teachers, you can't tell parents, you can't tell friends. Confidentiality means that whatever the student shares with you stays with you. However, like most rules, there are a few exceptions. So with confidentiality, there are 4 exceptions to confidentiality, okay? The first exception is that if the student is talking with you and you think that that student might hurt themselves or hurt someone else, that's a time when you have to tell somebody, okay? Another time is if you suspect that the child you are working with or another child or an elderly person has been or is being abused, you have to tell somebody, okay? And it's important that you say if you suspect abuse, okay? The third exception is if the courts or if lawyers were to get involved, and in this instance, the courts would get involved or lawyers would get involved, and you would talk with your student first, and you and the student together would decide what you guys would share and what you would not share. The fourth exception is if the student breaks a big school rule, okay? So for each grade levels, a big school rule is going to be different. So for example, in the elementary school level, it might be bullying, because bullying is a big issue at that level, and there's also legal issues that have to be followed. In high school, if there's drug, alcohol issues, if there's weapons, if there's pregnancy, those are times when you're going to have to tell somebody. And those are also instances where you could make the argument that you are afraid the student will hurt themselves or hurt someone else. And so that might be an example of a big school rule that you would have to talk to somebody about. At middle school, it can be a slew of different things. It can still be drugs and alcohol. It can be theft. It can be weapons, maybe bullying. It just kind of depends. And so, in counseling, what you have to do is, the first thing you have to do is you have to ask the student if they know what confidentiality means. Oftentimes they do not. So, after you find out that they do not know what it means, I suggest that you tell them, okay? After you tell them what confidentiality means, I suggest that at that point, you ask them to tell you in their own words what confidentiality means. This is where we check for their understanding. Oftentimes, they will not remember, even if you just told them. So again, you tell them what it means, and then you ask them to tell it back to you using their own words. Once they can say it back to you, then you move on to the exceptions, okay? You need to tell them that there are 4 exceptions. You need to state each exception, and you need to give examples of each exception. So you need to give an example of what it means if you think that the student might hurt themselves or somebody else. So give an example of what the student might say that would lead you to think that, okay? You have to also give an example for number 2, if you suspect that the student or another child or an elderly person is being abused. And this is physical abuse, it's sexual abuse, it's emotional abuse. Give them an example of what they might say that might make you suspect that abuse was occurring, okay? You also have to give them examples of if the courts would get involved, okay? The examples I tend to give is that sometimes in truancy issues, the courts might get involved, a judge might want to know what you guys are talking about. Sometimes if a student has a sibling who is maybe in the court system or again is truant, sometimes judges or lawyers want to kind of know how the student is doing, the student being your student, and so that might be a time. Sometimes in the case of adoption, judges or lawyers might get involved, and so you need to give examples, okay? You also need to give an example of a break in a big school rule. After you've explained these things and given examples, you have to ask them to tell you what the 4 exceptions are to confidentiality. They need to use their own words. They do not have to give you examples of each of the 4 exceptions, but they do need to state the 4 exceptions of confidentiality.